In spite of the fact that Google search trends have surged around the term dark romance, the sentiment on the internet is the same. Dark romance sucks. And I used to be its biggest hater. That is, until I read a good dark romance book. And then another, and then another. And I fear I've become a dark romance fan. I spent the last 6 months reading some of the best dark romance books that you've never heard of. So keep watching as I tell you what dark romance books are actually worth reading. Starting with a story I promise you haven't heard of before. And that is Lured by the Dusk by Angela J. Ford. This was actually one of the very first enemies to lovers books I've ever read, and it's actually a Pied Piper retelling, which I wasn't expecting and yet somehow enjoyed. The story follows our FMC Tanis, who's a young woman barely tolerated by her rich aunt and uncle who took her in after the untimely death of her parents. Plotting her escape from their abuse, she decides to explore a tomb and raid it. Apparently, this tomb is rumored to be filled with treasure, and turns out it's true. Loaded up with all the treasure that she can fit in her little arms, she quickly tries to make her escape until the owner of the tomb somehow wakes up. And her punishment is to marry him and watch as he destroys the entire town that she lives in. Now, I will say I did really enjoy the story. I did feel like there was a bit of a disconnect in the romance because it was an extreme slow burn. So keep that in mind, but it truly has Roman Empire levels of thought in my brain right now. Like I think about it almost every day. Next is the second darkest book on the list. Don't worry, the darkest book is coming up soon. And it is named The Scent of Us, Part 1. This is true for pretty much all of the books, especially the darkest one that I'm going to be talking about pretty soon. But this book does cover a lot of very difficult subject matter. So please read the content warnings at the start. And Omega is forced to bond with an abusive pack of alphas, but she finally feels a sense of hope. A scientific breakthrough was made in her world where bond dissolutions were finally made possible for Omegas in difficult situations like her. The story follows her escape and right into the next dilemma. She has to find a new pack to help her through her heats since her suppressants aren't going to work for very much longer. I personally loved that this story addressed what I think the world would actually be like if Omegas existed. I enjoyed that it addressed the power dynamics and how dark the world really would be. It also has some great diversity in characters that you usually don't see in Omegaverse books. These people weren't just written to be a certain culture, they were completely immersed and embedded in multiple cultures, whether that was through food or traditions, and it was very well done. Changing gears a little bit, but have you ever read a book that made you sob like a baby? So this was my face after finishing Soul Eater by Lily Mayne. The story opens to Danny, an expendable soldier sent right to the front of the lines to defeat a monster known as the Soul Eater. This infamous monster passes through some kind of veil or portal every few months and destroys humans. Nobody knows why he does it. All they do know is that the person ends up being a shriveled up husk of what they used to be, and the government is tired of it. So they decided to get rid of him. What they didn't know is that the Soul Eater wouldn't go down without swinging. When Danny is the only person on the front lines to not swing at or try to take down the Soul Eater, his life is spared. The Soul Eater is captured. The next morning when Danny wakes up, it turns out that he is set to be the liaison between the government officials and the Soul Eater himself, even though he is just a lowly soldier. He goes and meets the Soul Eater, but everything changes the moment Danny shows his face. There was so much action in this story, so many twists, so many turns. I was completely immersed in this story, and I think I read it within a 12-hour period. By the way, I started at I think 9 or 10 p.m., slept, and then continued the story. I personally also enjoyed how imperfect the Soul Eater character is, and how sometimes vulnerable and angry Danny, the main character, was as well. Usually we don't see that level of angry from a protagonist, so really great to see those kinds of human moments from him. So there are so many books in this series, and I will be continuing it. There were a few things that I wasn't the biggest fan of, and that includes the depiction of the intimate scenes, because this is an MM romance. There are certain things where I was like, really, girl? But if you can kind of get past that, you'll enjoy it. Next up is the darkest book on the list. It is depraved, it is disturbing, and I could not put it down. The book is A Hunt So Wild and Cruel, and it is actually a Christmas Carol retelling with a twist. FMC plays the role of Scrooge, and she's a bit of an ice queen. FMC was actually shipped off to a private boarding school, never to see her parents or kingdom again as a princess until she returns to become a queen. When her parents are assassinated by the very Fae, they decide to spend a lot more time with than her. After a particularly horrible day with her subjects, she is then visited by 3 spirits who promise to shape and mold her into the best queen she could possibly be. Her response was to launch an axe into the chest of one of them. Go off, girl. What she doesn't know is that she is the last assignment for these 3 spirits, and they're not leaving until they get what they want. This story is extremely dark, very violent, and should not be read under the covers during a weekday night while your fiance sleeps peacefully like a baby. But you know, here I am. The next book is written by one of my favorite authors, and that is Captive of the Horde King by Zoe Draven. The book opens to our FMC, a human refugee on the planet Dakar. She's on her way home after, I think, foraging or gathering, and she immediately notices that something is wrong. See, the entire planet has very restrictive rules as to who can till the land, who can use the land. Even though they were refugees who were mercifully taken in by these harsh aliens, they are continued to be at the mercy of these aliens because they can't live independently. They can't grow their own crops, they can't kill their own animals to eat, which has in fact left many human villages quite bitter, angry, and starving, including her own. When her little brother decides to break the rules and try to do something about it, she knows immediately that he will be punished. Instead, she takes his place. By taking his place, that means being captured by the Horde King and made his queen. In my opinion, the FMC's emotions are perfectly reflective of her past and her parentified experience of raising her brother alone after her mother's death. If you're looking for a well-written series to binge, this is absolutely it. This book does deal with a lot of difficult subjects, namely the fact that she is captured by a man and does not want to be with him. But things work out pretty interestingly. Next book is from a series I thought I was going to give up on, and I'm so glad that I didn't. It is The Widow and the Orcs by Finley Fenn. The book follows Lady Skull. She is a widow in charge of a grand piece of land. She is busy trying to fight off her nephew trying to take the land from her, handling her husband's debts, and keep her staff employed. She has no idea how she's going to do it all until she's visited by a wily orc named Killick. He is handsome and smart and makes her an offer she truly can't refuse. 10 nights of incredible pleasure with an orc named Ulfar. He's a broken and sad, almost shell of himself. And Killick knows and realizes that an encounter with a woman like Lady Skull may just be the thing to heal him. Lady Skull has to ask herself, is it worth getting into bed with the orcs to save herself, her staff, and her land with all the money that would be given to her by Ulfar and Killick? Or should she keep her dignity and pride and be stripped of her land and booted off eventually? I mean, I know what my answer would have been. But Killick gave her a day to decide. I wouldn't have needed that long. What I loved about this story is Lady Skull was a rebel. She was outspoken and yet a lady, smart and observant. I found that this book did her a great service, unlike some of the other books in this series. I also loved Killick and Ulfar's relationship, and I find that Finley Fenn's books always leaves enough room for the MMCs if they're together to have their own moments, and that was definitely done in this story. And if you made it this far, I actually have a 2-book recommendation. Look, I'm so generous. So generous. So let's end with a classic in the dark romance genre. That is Bad Guy and Worst Guy by Ruby Dixon. These books follow 2 women in very different points of a timeline in the series. There are quite a amount of similarities in the series that you'll notice. Now, both MMCs in the story are clones of a gladiator. He was an absolutely horrible person and was cloned so that their owners could use him to fight again and again. Bad Guy, the FMC, was actually a slave who was enlisted to basically make the MMC behave himself. In Worst Guy, the FMC was assigned to help the MMC reacclimate into society as a social worker, almost as a challenge so that she can assist other humans who are in the same situation as her in the past. In each of these stories, we see the clone actually gain consciousness, develop empathy, and grapple with their traumas. Same with the FMCs. They had to deal with their own traumas and issues, but also grapple with the fact that the MMC, he's not very good looking. These stories also take place in space as the MMC is an alien. Now, all of these book recs don't even matter if you don't know how to use Kindle Unlimited. Watch this video on my essential tips that I learned after reading over 200 books on Kindle Unlimited in 2024.